Good morning. Today we're going to be talking about how we can work with the basic idea of ArrayLists. I'm Cody Henriksen, and let's go ahead and get started. So the ArrayList is the default dynamic data structure we use in AP Computer Science A right now. It's part of the Java Collections framework, and that's a great tool to do all sorts of cool things about storing information and manipulating data. We're specifically using with objects. One of the big things we want to make sure we remember is when we're talking about ArrayLists do not work with primitives. Instead, ArrayLists can only hold object data types. So things that are stuff that usually you create, or things like strings that are built into the Java language. So if you want to store a whole bunch of numbers, you have to make sure you use the wrapper classes. So like you want to put them in the integer or a double class, or for bizarre reason, if you're using booleans, capital B boolean. One of the really powerful features of an ArrayList is it's resizable. ArrayLists grow and shrink as you put the data in and take it out. So it grows and is usable as you go along with it. It's a great thing. So you can, basically it holds just enough space for what you're working with. Now the one thing you have to remember when working with an ArrayList is it needs a type. So I'll always use my hands like this when I talk about it in class. It has the, I call them gang signs in class, but it's the gang type. It's what you're storing inside that. You have to type your ArrayList. It needs to know what it's holding. It's designed to be more efficient and a better structure when it's holding, it's only holding strings, it's only holding cars, it's holding animals. And if it's holding animals, then I can put a person inside there because a person is an animal. But that type right there is how I use it so we can load what's going to go inside it and hold those pieces. When we use the ArrayList constructor, we build our object. Our ArrayList is constructed. So my ArrayList of type string words equals new ArrayList of type string parens. So that creates our ArrayList. It builds the ArrayList right there. But what's inside it? Nothing. It's empty. So when you create your ArrayList, nothing is inside it. There's not like a whole bunch of nulls like you have when you're creating an array of objects inside Java. There's not like a whole bunch of empty space inside there. No, it's an empty list. There's nothing in there yet. And so there's no way to give a certain number of spots. It's not like, say, for example, in C++, you have your vector tool. You can initialize, my vector is this big to start off with. No. An ArrayList, when it's initialized with how much inside it? Nothing. It's an empty thing. So when you create your ArrayList, it's simply just there to hold stuff. Nothing's in there yet. You have to actually put it inside before anything happens. There's a whole bunch of methods you need to know in ArrayList. There's a lot of things they can do. However, we're going to talk about the really important ones you positively have to know. These are the ones that you can use, and basically anything you need to work with in ArrayList you can handle by working with these methods. The first one is add item. So the item is whatever object type you're putting inside that. I'm just using this to simply demonstrate it. And that puts the object that you're talking about, that current object, at the end of the list. So it puts one thing of it right there in the list. It doesn't hurt the original object. It just takes that object and says, hey, you're now in the list at the end. The next one is the add, passing an index and an item as well. What this one does is it says, hey, I want to put the item that you're talking about, but I want to put it at the spot you're specifying in the index. And it has to be less than or equal to the size of the list. So it can be anywhere from 0 up to the end of the list. Because if I give it the size of the list, it actually just puts it to the end. It's like doing the first one. I mean, I can do that, but this is basically like, I'm right here with this list of stuff, boom, 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 and I want to put this one in the middle. So I just tell it to go to this spot right here, and it puts it in right here, and everything that was at the spot gets shifted over by 1. It's an amazing feature, so it doesn't hurt any of the existing information. It just moves them all down 1 bigger. So it's a great way to put things in a list, and you want to put something in at the middle. So use the add index one. The next one we have, and this is probably the most common method you'll ever use with an ArrayList, is the get method. I want to retrieve information out of it. I often have to stop myself from saying the word get when I'm talking about how to use this when I'm using quizzes and stuff because it's such a common thing. We're getting the information out of it. And all you have to do for that is pass it the index as a parameter and say, hey, retrieve for me what's at that spot. And that's going to grab what's in there. Doesn't take it out of the list, doesn't hurt the item or anything like that, but it just receives the access to that point. So it's a way to get that information and use it. Okay? The index needs to be between 0 and 1 less than the size of the list because, again, when we're talking about ArrayList, just like when we're talking about an array, we start off at 0, we go up to size minus 1. So you have to make sure that the index you're giving it is within that realm because otherwise you'll throw an exception. That's not a happy thing. And again, like I said, this is probably the most commonly used method you have inside an ArrayList. We use this all the time, especially inside loops when we're talking about manipulating data structures. There's some more methods we want to talk about. Of course, we have the set method. This is the replacement. This is the one that's most like when we're talking about using an array as well. So if you're talking about using an array or an array list, the set is more like what happens when we're using an array because you can only replace values in that. The way we work that is we put the index as the first parameter and the item we want to replace into as the second parameter. And what that does is it goes through the list, finds that spot, And whatever was in there takes it out, puts this new one in that spot, and then returns the one that was in there back to whoever called this. A lot of the time that replacement value is not used, it just gets thrown away, so it just is a way of disposing that value. But if you're replacing values, you always get access to what you were putting in the list at that spot. One of the things you really need to stress on this has caused a lot of people problems when they're writing exams, especially for the free response section on the AP CSA exam. You cannot use the set method to create values. It doesn't add anything. It has to only go for values that are existing at that spot. So 0 to size minus 1, and you can only replace those values. You can't add with this at all. It can only replace values. So you cannot use this to add. Okay, really big, gotta stress this. This lost people a lot of points in a couple exams. So you want to make sure you never use this to add, only to replace values. The last two methods we're using all the time in an array list are the remove index and the size methods. The remove it index one, it says I'm going to take the object at that spot and I want to take it out. So I'm going to take it and my list is going to shrink. Again, we talked about how earlier that an array list is resizable, and this allows us to shrink the list easily. Okay, this takes the list a lot smaller, and the object that was at that spot, the one that I take it out, I give it back to whoever called me. Now, again, just like with set, if I don't use that object as a return value, it just gets thrown away and garbage collection takes it and disposes of it as it needs to. But this is a way you can actually remove something out of the list. You can use it again if you need to. Quite often you do. But if you don't use it, it just gets thrown away, turns into garbage collection. The last method is size. Size is one that we use all the time. We use this every time we're writing a loop that uses a standard for loop to go over it. Hey, is it less than size? Okay, we're good to go. But size tells us how many things we're working with inside the list. And remember that size gives us the number in human terms. So if there's nothing in the list, it returns as 0. If there's one thing in the list, it returns 1. This is not index-based like we were talking about for looking at the remove, the get, the set, etc., or add index. But rather it returns how many things are in there. We're using human counting styles, not indices, which start at 0. So human counting starts at 1, 2, 3, 4, 8,006. But where indices always start at 0. So that's the thing we need to remember when we're talking about this. The size gives us the counting of them, the number, the human value of it, versus the index, which is one off on that. So there's a couple other things that are great for array lists, things that aren't necessarily the ones you have to know, but they're great ones to use. I use them a lot when I'm writing my code, when I'm working with students as well, but they're great ones to have right there. The first one is the .contains. This is the built-in search feature in an array list. If you know an object is possibly in there and you know that object has a .equals method or a way of comparing within it, you can just use .contains on that and retrieve the object yes or no if it's in there. So .contains returns a Boolean whether or not it's in there or not. It iterates through the entire structure. It's a great way to just say, hey, is it in there? Yes. Okay, cool. And so it returns whether that was in there and just moves from there. We also have the .clear. The .clear is amazing. Say you don't want to remake your entire array list, you don't want to make a brand new object all the time, but you want to restore information over and over again, especially say, for example, you're dealing with a lot of dynamic data. The .clear method is the great way to do that. It erases everything that was in the list and you still have a new initialized array list right there, but with nothing attached to it. Especially say, for example, if you're retrieving real data, like say, for example, tweets, API results from a web call or something like that. The .clear method is a great way to reinitialize your array list with new information so you can have only the exact information you need for that current query. That's a great one to use. Quick little tip, again, remind yourself that when you're talking about an array list, the indices start at 0 and that goes to size minus 1. Size itself always gives us a human number because when we're talking about size, it's how much do we see inside that. And remember the gang signs, the angle brackets we're talking about. You have to make sure to use that whenever you write the word array list inside your code. So anytime you write the word array list, so when you're declaring a variable or initializing the variable with a constructor call, those array lists always get those gang signs. That's always going to be there. Indices are less than 0, always throw an exception, so never try and pass a negative number to an index. If you do, it's going to crash and throw an exception, and we don't want that to happen. Always make sure your indices are between 0 and size, never less than 0, and hopefully never greater in size, because if you do so, it'll throw an exception, crash your app, and you never want that to happen. And one final tip, especially for manipulating when we're working with an array list, if you want to search and remove data out of an array list, the best way to do that is going from the back to the front. The reason being is because when you're searching and matching through things, if you search and go match through forward, when you remove something like that because it shrinks automatically down, that means you're going to have to then move your indice counter back to go back and check that one. Otherwise, you'll skip over values and it doesn't work as well. So when you're removing items from a list, the best way to do is start your list loop at the end and you'll work your way backward. That way, if you remove things, it only affects the things that you've already looked at, and it won't cause any problems to search through the data, and you don't have to skip anything like that. And so that's a great way to do when you're working with ArrayLists, is go backwards, make sure you start at the end, and move to the front when you have to search and remove things. Thanks again, have a great day, and review your ArrayLists. Thanks, bye-bye.